Welcome to Fertility Friendly Food, the podcast. My name is Stephanie Vlakis and I'm an expert certified fertility dietitian and nutritionist and founder of The Dietologist, a multiple award-winning virtual fertility and pregnancy nutrition clinic serving thousands from around the world, and of course, the host of this pod, Fertility Friendly Food. This podcast is dedicated to all things health and nutrition in the world of fertility, reproductive health, and pregnancy. Each week, I bring you practical snack-sized episodes to help improve your lifestyle on your trying to conceive journey, alongside guest expert interviews to help inspire you to learn and grow whilst you grow your family. Welcome back to another episode of Fertility Friendly Food, the podcast. This week's episode is a really interesting one, a topic that comes up a lot with our one-on-one clients in our virtual clinic, which is sex and intimacy and relationships and conception. It seems obvious enough that sex is a decently important ingredient for people in male-female couples to conceive, but it can certainly get a lot more complicated when it comes to timing everything and the pressure, the performance anxiety, the fatigue, the resent. It can all really build up and become a huge barrier to conception. So I have invited Amanda Grogan, who is a qualified counsellor who has a special interest in sex and intimacy as well as chronic illnesses as an endometriosis warrior herself. So in this episode, we're going to pick her brains and learn some practical strategies to think about when it comes to prioritizing sex, intimacy in your relationship when trying to conceive. Welcome, Amanda Grogan, to Fertility Friendly Food, the podcast. A long time coming. Excited to have you on.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. It's such an honor and really excited to talk about sex, as always.
Yes, a great topic to be talking about indeed, and a pretty critical ingredient when it comes to trying to conceive and making a baby. So before we get into the sex chat, let's hear a little bit more about you and what you do so our listeners can get to know you a bit better.
Sure. So my name's Amanda and I'm a qualified counsellor and I've got my own private practice. So personally, I've got endometriosis and it was really important for me that I give back to my community and have at least part of my practice being for people with chronic illness, and that can be all kinds of chronic illness. There's obviously a little bit more bias towards endo, but because for me, I really struggled finding a mental health professional that understood the unique points of chronic illness and how that might interact with some of the suggestions they're making. And I couldn't find that. So I thought, all right, well, I want to try and do that. And then for me personally, I just really so interested in the science of sex and relationships. So I've been studying that for over 10 years. And that is just, I consume everything, whether it be research and information for work, but even just in my personal life, I love to listen to podcasts and read books on the topic. So that's why I wanted to focus my practice there. And that obviously overlaps, a little bit as well, where I'm really lucky that I can help my clients explore sex and relationships in relation to their endo and other things they might be asking about. But it also means then that I might be looking after people who don't have a chronic illness, but instead are wanting help to understand their desire, their kinks, their relationships. So I work with both individuals and couples and groups as well.
Incredible. It's incredible work that you do in both. And there's so much crossover as well, right? And we'll get to that. But yeah, it's great work that you do. And we've done a Instagram live before over on my endo page, which was really helpful as well. So you can go and get more of Amanda's insights on sex, intimacy and endometriosis over there as well. That's a topic that interests you. I'll leave it linked in the show notes. So let's talk about sex, baby. When it comes to unassisted conception, naturally many people think of sex. After all, it's that classical way we think about getting pregnant. although there's lots of ways to get pregnant. People at first may be excited about the novelty of baby-making sex, but as the months wear on without a positive pregnancy test, it can become a lot more scheduled, feel a lot more like a chore. You're trying to be more precise about the timing so you don't have to have as much sex. How common is this experience amongst people trying to conceive?
I think this is probably the most common experience that I hear. And that's not just in my practice, but that's when I'm out in the community. That's my girlfriends, that's my family, talking to them. And yeah, it's sort of funny. It's that, I've got to have sex again. And maybe people who aren't trying to conceive don't understand that. But yeah, anything that you are doing that you have to do can start to feel a bit like a chore. It's really normal, and often, just like a lot of conversations around sex, really taboo. So we might not know how common this is. And then what really happens there, I find, is a lot of emotions around shame, anxiety, fear, even anger, of why is this happening to me? Why is this so hard? Why am I struggling? When actually, this is a really, really common experience that people struggle with this. And I think if that was the one thing we could have people maybe walk away with, even in just the first few minutes, is it's not okay, but it is common, right? So I don't want you to when I say it's not okay, I don't want you to have to deal with this alone and think there's no help. But it is something that if you can find a community, whether it be trusted loved ones, whether it be groups online or communities like you've set up here with your podcast community, I think we start seeing how many people go through this journey, and maybe then we can give ourselves a bit of kindness back to go, it's okay. It's all right if I'm sick of it this month. It's all right if I'm struggling a bit, if, this is bringing up a lot for me. If we can try and be understanding for ourselves, because there's nothing worse than sort of going through that difficultiness and then beating ourselves up for the way we handled it, right?
Totally. And I think as well, it's that line between, for a lot of people who are trying to conceive perhaps for the very first time, sex is going from, pleasurable and often spontaneous to timed, and there's a sense of pressure and there's functionality to sex. Like, I know there's lots of functions to sex, but it becomes this very this very pleasurable to functional almost is how I kind of phrase it. And I think you repeat that a lot of times and yes, it can feel arduous.
Absolutely. And it's kind of quite counter to a lot of maybe sex educators, sex positive ideas that we've had, the local zeitgeist for the last 10 years, which is talking about pleasure-based sex. Expand your definition beyond penetration, take that off the table, counter to that. So it can be quite, like you said, that taking away maybe the sexy, what you would just naturally do. And now it's almost like, all I can do is that. It can feel stifling. It can feel, well, what if I'm in pain? What if I don't want to be penetrated? That's a really different energy, right? So you have to sort of have that. And it's like a lot of things, isn't it? As soon as someone said, like, I remember bit of a funny analogy, but when you're at school, I loved reading, and every time you turned around, you'd find me in a corner reading a book. As soon as the English teacher said, we have to read this, I was like, no, I don't want to read. So there's something about that pressure we put ourselves when we say we have to. And I think when we look at our fertility window and use that wording or have that messaging of we have to, then that brings up so many blocks and things straight away, even if it's just something that we might like as much as sex, right?
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of your top tips to help maintain a healthy sex life whilst trying to conceive? And I know many of our listeners will have their phones at the ready with the notes app open to take notes, because this is something that comes up a lot for our clients in our clinic. Perhaps the frequency of sex is higher than what they usually would have done, or perhaps they're finding that there's less room for those other experiences that aren't related to penetration because it doesn't feel like it's quote unquote getting the job done. And so there's kind of a shift in the way that sex is approached. And so, any tips that you have for those trying to conceive who want to maintain the health of their sex lives?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I think is really important, and taking a back step, I actually think this is really great information for everyone to have, but it's about understanding responsive desire. So I'm not sure if you've heard of this term before. One of the best, so if you've got your notes out ready, one of the best educators on this is Emily Nagoski. And she wrote this brilliant book called Come As You Are. And she's got quite a few podcast iterations, TED Talks, those sorts of YouTube clips about it. So you can find a way to hear the theory, read it, hear it in a way that's going to be palatable to you. But essentially what the idea is for a lot of us, and this is probably more reported from people who are women or identify as women, that we experience responsive desire. So we maybe don't experience bam, I'm horny, or bam, I'm aroused. What might happen is we don't feel that, and then we get a response to a stimuli. So we see something, maybe we're watching a movie and a sexy scene comes on that wasn't expected. Maybe our partner starts kissing us, and that's when the desire and the arousal begins. And so why I think this is so important when it comes to trying to conceive is that gap between, okay, here's my fertility window. I quote unquote have to try. Like you said, there's that mentality, right? But I really don't feel like it. I've been at work all week. It's Friday night. I'm really tired. I would just like a cup of tea and to watch, Netflix. So I don't feel it, right? I don't feel desire. And then what might be happening is we feeling guilty to ourselves or feeling forced, or our partner's picking up on that, going, oh, I feel that you don't really want to, but you're saying yes, and that can be quite confusing. But if we can go, okay, that Friday night scenario, I'm not feeling desire, but check in with ourselves, am I open to feeling it? So what that might look like is, let's start with a massage. Let's start with kissing, absolutely no expectation. And as we do that, if the desire comes along, if I get responsive desire, let's continue. And if I don't, then I think one of the healthiest things that we could say is, let's remember we're individuals. Let's remember we're a couple, and we don't have to force it. I understand there's probably a lot of people that may be hearing this going, but what if I miss the window then? I don't feel it. Amanda's saying, don't force it. You'll be okay if you miss one opportunity, even 2, 3, 4 opportunities. Maybe you miss the whole window that month. But that can be like listening to yourself and true to what you want, your partner wants, and leaning into that idea of, will my desire come along if we give it a go? And if it doesn't, can we ensure that there's no pressure and that's okay to say? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I think, it's often the way that I talk about nutrition, to make an analogy to my world, in the sense that, if making dietary changes is causing you more stress and anxiety, then it's probably not worth it to make the dietary change. If it's not going to help all parts of you, then maybe it's not worth the change. And it's not to say that means like, oh, you just shouldn't have sex and you won't conceive and full stop, end of story. That's not what you're saying either. I think there is a middle ground, and I think it's when we're constantly like abrasively going against what we want to do, that resentment and that chore-like element of sex becomes over time. And, you may think, oh, first couple of months, some people first 6 months, 12 months, oh, it's all fine, still fun, there's no issues. But, I talk to people who've been trying to conceive for 5 years or 10 years. It's a long time for anybody, and to have that pressure and also the emotions around, not being pregnant and PMS and hormones that you might be on for different types of fertility treatments. And so you layer all those things on, and it becomes a lot more charged in terms of the emotions and the feelings around it as well.
Absolutely. And if you, again, maybe look outside of conceiving, how often do we tell people enthusiastic consent? If it's not a hell yeah, it's not a yeah. Mm. Not only is that then potentially quite confusing for us and our partner, but we can then feel the no in our body and then we're pushing forward and having sex, that can actually be really emotionally tolling. It can be potentially damaging. So to be able to say, yeah, it's okay if tonight I eat the popcorn, for your analogy, or in mine, we don't have sex, right? And I think some other really healthy tips are, obviously this is going to be super different for every couple, right? I don't want to be too prescriptive, but sometimes you might find that because it is functionary that you're going, all right, let's get in there with the minimal function we can, right? Let's get you excited, let's penetrate, let's be over. Well, yeah, that might work. Some people might go, that's actually the best way for us to do it during the fertility window, especially modern day scheduling, like you can, oh, this is the best way. But there's also nothing stopping you from having, a 3-hour session where 2.5 hours of it is oral sex or foreplay, and then there is a little bit of penetration on the side. So what works for both of you? And I think that what can be really helpful is keeping your energy and flirting around sex maintained around the entire month, so that we're not shutting ourselves down for, say, 3-ish odd weeks, and then on that last one, now we're starting to view each other as sexy or put that mindset on. If we're remembering to flirt with our partner, even if we aren't able to conceive, on that day, we're still engaging in sexual energy and eroticism. That doesn't have to necessarily lead to sex, but it might stop that sort of blunt, we're doing this and now we're doing this, like, this to-do list. You got to mop the floors. We got to prep for next week. We got to have sex. Maybe if we're adding in that or keeping up that sexual energy and flirting, that might help the relationship feel less like a chore, even when there might be a little bit of a chore component to it.
You've touched on a point that I commonly hear from men in particular, which is, I only feel like she wants to have sex with me in that time. So I feel like not used, but again, it's that I'm just good for one thing kind of thing. And so I think the other component is not to just concentrate all the sex, like what you said, sexual energy, but even sex to just that time. And that can be really helpful as well for both partners. And I think, obviously I'm not a man and I don't identify as a man, and so I can't speak from that perspective, but I do hear that frequently. I imagine that's something you encounter in your practice and just in the community as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I do hear men use the exact words I feel used. And then, this is probably a whole other podcast tangent, but that is a really uncommon experience we allow men to talk about, right? This idea that women might be used for sex is quite common. We talk about this in lots of different ways and we understand what that feels like. It can feel quite icky at a minimum, really, but we don't often talk about what that's like for men. And we maybe put upon them some myths and stereotypes, like he's going to love it because he wants sex all the time anyway. So this is great because now he has to, or he gets this free sort of use. And no, men have emotions as well. Men do not always want to have sex just like us. And probably, you think about even the medical term is really quite gross when you break it down, but erectile dysfunction. You're dysfunctional. There's something inherently wrong and you're failing if you're not able to produce this bodily function of getting erect. And we know, maybe lots of listeners might know, as a woman or someone who identifies, if we're all up in our head, it can be incredibly hard to orgasm. If we are anxious, it can be really hard to orgasm. Similar for men to be able to get erect. If they are in their head, that can be really difficult. And it's a very common experience for men. And under the age of 50, it's generally not to do with their body as such. It is to do, so they've got the ability to get erect, but it's something going on in their headspace. So we put a lot of pressure on men to provide and be strong, and that will often then extend to trying to conceive. So we might not understand they're having a difficult experience, and we might not understand the pressures or what they're struggling with. And so as a couple, remembering, there is two of you. And if you're a support person, remembering there are two people that are trying to conceive there that will need some of the same support, but potentially also different levels of support as well.
Yeah. That performance anxiety element is such a significant issue for people that identify as men and men. And it's that, I have to perform. It's the ovulation window. I don't want to disappoint them. I know this is the one thing I got to do to make this baby that I also want to have. And that can be really psychologically distressing, not only for the person that it's happening to, but also their partner. And I've seen this become actually a really decent point of contention within relationships when trying to conceive. And it's a really tricky topic, I imagine, to kind of navigate, because it's almost one of those situations where the more you focus on it, almost sometimes the worse it gets. Sometimes you want to identify and call out any barriers to conception, but at the same time, I feel like sometimes the more we focus on things like that, the more attention and anxiety that then breeds. It's kind of like this positive hamster wheel situation. So what are some of your insights there on that topic?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And this is very similar experience, I think, the performance for men in general. And then it's really heightened for those trying to conceive because, it's the most beautiful, pure end goal, isn't it? We want a baby, we want to start a family, we want a child. So, that puts the stakes pretty high. And so one of the things, bringing it back to what we sort of talked about before, is how can we increase other parts of sex, and remembering that sex is not just penetration. You don't have to have any penetration to have sex. Now, obviously, for trying to conceive, there does need to be, but can we expand so that's only a small portion and we're not focusing on that? Can we bring in other forms of intimacy so our male partner feels loved, they feel like they're not being used, they maybe feel that they're able to perform in other ways that help, that they want to, by expanding the other kinds of sex and intimacy we have around the penetration. I think that can be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where kind of more relationshipy stuff, but like love languages and, other forms of intimacy and connection also become really valuable, because if that's fallen away and all you've got left is kind of sex, then that feeling of feeling used in quotation marks and that performance anxiety can worsen. Whereas if you're connecting on those other levels that your partner receives well, then typically that can foster a better kind of translation to sex as well.
Absolutely. And look, I don't want anyone to think that I talk in absolutes, because it's always super different for the individual. But, I find in my practice and a lot of the time when I dive into this topic, a lot of men access love via sex. And we could talk for days about why that may be. One of the leading reasons I find is because we tell them they're not able to be emotional, and maybe it's not a manly trait to be outwardly affectionate and loving, but they're allowed to have sex. So maybe for some men, what they've internalized is the only place that I can access intimacy, or the best place I can access it, is via sex. So now there's this really, this cloud over there of not just the sex, but their love and intimacy. So what you might find is that they're feeling, that's quite this arena that they have to express themselves that way is being encroached on. So really understanding, and this is great for all couples regardless of what's going on, but understanding each other's internal minds. How does your mind work? What are your landmines, or the things that maybe you're more sensitive to that might upset you a little bit more, that you're more anxious about? Lay that all out on the table. Communicate, so that you know exactly what you are both experiencing and how can you combat that. And love language is a really beautiful one. If people are listening haven't heard of those, there's 5 different love languages, and it's essentially this idea of how can you look at everything maybe your partner's doing and increase the signs of ways they're showing you love? Or how can you appeal and speak in your partner's language to be most effective? So one of them is words of affirmation, which would be potentially encouraging them. You are so sexy and you provide and give so much to the family. So you're affirming them. For someone else, it might be physical touch. So looking at other forms of intimacy. What does your partner like that's not just sexual intimacy? There's many other forms.
Yes, I am touch. I'm just like, please be a koala onto me.
Yeah,
I want to be touched at all times, please.
Yes. Why are you stopping touching me? That doesn't make sense.
Yeah. When I was dating, every time I went on a date and somebody wouldn't hold my hand, I would be like, or touch me in any way. I was like, you don't even like me.
Yes, which is why I love the love languages, because sometimes people don't realize. And like one of them is something like acts of service. And so taking out the rubbish every day, you might not necessarily, you might not jump to thinking that that's a loving act, but for someone that could be how they express that. So it's kind of, picking up on those ways that are going to really speak so much more volumes to you. So it'd be so easy. All right, Steph loves touch. That's going to be so much easier to make Steph feel loved than if I maybe write her a love letter. It's not saying you won't like that, but it won't give you that feeling as quickly and as fulfillingly as touch might.
Yes. I recall a history of somebody giving me a poem and I was icked out by it. It said poem. I was like, ooh.
Oh, yes.
I was like, no, don't do that.
Roses
I can't.
Violets are blue.
That's not my love language.
Fair.
Oh, dear.
And that's exactly why, like I said, everything we're talking about translate for you. What works for you as a couple, what needs do you have, and got to be really in tune to each other and remembering you and your partner are a team, and if you're sitting at a table, you are both sitting on the same side of the table and the problem's on the other side, right? So you're together facing the problem of we're struggling to conceive. How together do we do that? Not looking at each other as the enemy or the problem. You can't perform or you are struggling to feel desire and blaming or looking at the other person, which when we are probably, if we're trying to conceive, probably dealing with something else like endometriosis or health concerns. So we might have symptoms. It's a really emotional time because this is something we desire so much. So it's really easy to turn on each other, unfortunately, and trying to remember that actually, no, the reason, like, why do we want to do this? Because we want a family. Why do we want a family? Ideally, it's because you have matched values and commitment and you want to be a team. So how can you extend that even into your pre-parenting?
Yep, absolutely. It's all part of that preconception preparation is like people need to like do a little relationship health check too, I think, because, trying to conceive, pregnancy, birth, all these experiences are huge life experiences, and one person is physically experiencing it more typically than the other in most couple dynamics. And so, I think that relationship can become under pressure, and having those conversations really openly and upfront, I think, is really helpful. I know a friend of mine, I think in her marital counselling that she had to do before her particular church married them, did marital counselling about, what happens if you struggle to conceive? What would you do? What options would you both consider? What wouldn't you consider? And I was like, that's so good, because you already know, and of course it can change, but you know roughly where the other person sits on topics that maybe you will never, and hopefully you will never have to encounter. But how good is it that you know that before you get married and potentially have a child together?
Absolutely. And, your particular friend did that at a church. I encourage as many people as possible to get premarital counselling or maybe pre-commitment if you're not looking at marriage, regardless of religious state, because that
Yeah, of course.
you can have all the love there in the world, but I mean, like, I'm 36 and I never learnt at school how to have a healthy relationship. There was no conversation around communication, expectations, maintenance, anything like that. So, yeah, look, this might be super hard, but if you're going to be parents, I'm pretty guarantee you there'll be some hard days out there after, right? So this can be actually, if we look to sort of look at a different perspective, how can we reframe this? I say a lot in therapy, reframing. How can we reframe this and go, yeah, obviously none of us would wish struggles with conceiving on anybody, right? But how can we look at this as an opportunity to practice our teamwork, to practice our solutions-based problem solving, our communication skills, and that is going to take you so, so far when you do conceive and with your family in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Great conversation. I want to shift gears slightly and talk about people that experience pain with sex. So some common causes and conditions: endometriosis, vaginismus, vulvodynia, and pelvic pain in general. Sometimes intercourse and penetrative intercourse in particular can be quite painful. And that can be a big barrier to conception for those who wish to become parents, but also just people who wish to enjoy sex. What workarounds or strategies or, what kind of conversations are you having with your clients in this arena?
So probably where I would first open it up is, where do both of your understandings around pain education, or what learnings have you done? What have you studied or researched? How much do you understand the way that pain works? And one of the reasons why this is so important is our emotional state does affect our pain. Now, I'm not at all saying that your pain is in your head or that you make your pain at all. However, you will feel it more. It will affect your body differently depending on your emotional state. So even that snippet, you really do need to dive a bit more so you understand the nuances. But even that snippet is so important, because if we are in pain and we add trying to conceive, so we have these emotions of fear, anxiety, fear, what we might find is our pain increases. And then our fear of sex and penetration may increase, and it may become more of a cycle. So really understanding, in general, pain education, and then taking that one step further and looking at what is your pain roadmap. And I think you and I touched on this a little bit on our live as well, of, okay, so hopefully you know that for yourself. You know what position, what depth of penetration, where you are in your cycle, what's going on for you is more likely to cause pain during sex and what's not. And then sharing that roadmap together, I think that is really important. And hopefully these are things you've started to dive a little bit into before you're trying to conceive. But if you haven't, that's okay too. This can be a good time. Again, you don't just have to concentrate on those moments of penetration, because if you are in pain, you might only be able to do that for a few minutes sustainably, right? Without it being physically really awful and therefore emotionally for you and your partner. So understanding your own roadmap and looking at and going, okay, so let's have a look and say, let's use me for example. Amanda's got a really small window. After 5 minutes of penetration, she is starting to get to a level of pain she can't continue or cope with. So how can we get creative around that? Something like a tool, there's one called an O-Nut. Have you heard of those before? Yeah, they're so fun. Have a look at them on Instagram, or I'm sure they've got a website too. But it's silicone rings that you can use to your own preference to change the depth of penetration. So that could be something that may help allow you to have a longer window for penetration. Or we could look at, again, the lead up. So get creative with your foreplay. Can you have a lot of oral sex? Can you manually stimulate your partner right up until they might be ready, and then you're able to be penetrated. What might out of the box might work for you that way. But I think really you need to understand what's going on in your body, because there's not going to be one way to navigate this, right? So really understanding yourself intimately. And look, you really have to do your research. I don't want to sort of endorse any specific brands, but there are sperm-friendly lubrications out there. So that is something. So if you are listening, you may not want to go, to Woolies and just get any lubrication that you see. Do your research to double check, maybe talk to your medical team. But there are some products out there that are sperm friendly. So increased lubrication can help in any kind of penetrative sex. So may help you trying to conceive.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that I've seen a few clients work on with their medical team is either pursuing IUIs, which is intrauterine insemination, which is a medical procedure where sperm can be kind of injected, not the best word, not like a needle injected, but I guess shot up into the uterus at the right time. Yeah, they call it the turkey baster. But I have seen, and I don't know if this is recommended or not, but I do know of people who do it at home as well. And it's not called an intrauterine because obviously you're not going to traverse the cervix on your own, but it's more just getting the sperm up there. And so then that kind of reduces that pain element. Not come to zero, but can be a workaround. But obviously that's all something that you'd have to discuss with your fertility specialist. And they usually give you, if you are going to attempt that at home, they usually give you advice about how to go about that. But I have seen that before.
I think that's part of the creative solution as well. And yeah, really looking at what are my needs. And so if painful sex is a high one, remembering that you should not need to sacrifice your comfort and your body in such a dramatic way while you're trying to conceive. And sometimes, again, because like beautiful babies, that's what we've got in our mind. We're thinking of our families, and it can be so easy, especially as women, it can be so easy to pop that at the very top priority, and nothing supersedes that. I don't care how much pain I'm in. I don't care how emotional it is. I don't care how much it costs. I don't care how long it takes. That is the priority. Now, I'm not saying don't make that your priority, but in individual moments, absolutely, you can prioritize yourself. You can say, this is too painful and we need to find another more creative, exciting solution. This month is just a no for me. I'm in such a level of pain, fertility window of not, I can't do that. And let's extend this to our partner as well. Maybe they're having a god-awful month, and that week for them, they just go, doesn't matter how many ways you try and connect with me, we try and build sex intimacy and desire, I'm not able to. It's okay in that moment to choose not being in pain, to choose not being emotionally distressed over trying to conceive. And that doesn't make you a bad mum to be. That doesn't make you a bad partner. That makes you a human, and it means that you are exhausted from something that is really difficult. So again, coming back to that kindness to yourself, and it's okay if you need a workaround.
Yeah, beautiful words. Good one to remember, everyone. Okay, when it comes to fertility treatments, I briefly talked about IUI and say IVF. Sex is actually typically removed from the equation. In fact, in most treatment cycles, couples are advised against having sex, unprotected sex. And how can people, I often get clients being like, I don't understand. I don't understand. And I think that's an argument for some people who feel quite strongly against fertility treatments. It's like, oh, it's so clinical, it's so mechanical, we don't even have to have sex for this to happen. Like, oh, like how is this affecting the conception? And I can appreciate that perspective, but I think, I'm sure you'll share, how is there some ways that people can like reinitiate some intimacy during that time where maybe medically unprotected sex is off the table for safety reasons?
Absolutely. Do you know what, Steph? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a big one.
yeah, with all my clients, no one has specifically told me that part of the journey. And so when I was preparing for this and I saw that, I was like, I was blown away. You can't have sex? Like, what? And I texted one of my really good girlfriends who's had struggles conceiving, who's been through an IVF journey, and said, did this happen to you? Is this right? But yeah. And so I had to sit with that for a little while. I'm not personally trying to conceive, but that information was really mind-blowing to me to even hear. So it's okay if that takes you through the loop a little bit and you have emotions that might come up around, like you said, oh, well, that feels a bit clinical, or oh, that doesn't feel, and you can't see me now, but I'm doing air quote, natural or anything like that, right? So I can understand how many emotions would come up. What I wonder is if we can bring this back again to expanding our definition of sex really past penetration. And so many people, it's synonymous. And that's been the way for a long time. If you cast back, just a little anecdote, but when Bill Clinton was president of the United States and he said that he didn't have sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky because they didn't have penetrative sex. And at that time, they did a survey of college students in America and asked the same question. Do you count, say, oral sex only as sex? And the percentage of people that said, no, that's not sex, was really high. I can't remember off the top of my head now. So really we do. We default to think sex is just penetration. So gosh, it throws us through a loop when you say you can't take that off the table. I mean, you've got to take that off the table. And for a few different ways, for some people they might, if they're having painful sex, they might go, oh, hallelujah, like that's great. We can find another way. Like if it was me, gosh, that would make me more horny than anything else you could do to be like, you cannot have sex, Amanda. I'd be like, I could what?
Yep. And then add all these hormones on top.
Yeah, that's
Things
right.
can change.
So one of my favourite relationship psychotherapists, Esther Perel, she talks oh God, I love her. Yes. She talks deeply about this idea. Where do you go when you're having sex? What are you accessing? And if we asked hundreds and hundreds of people, very few would say it's purely for the physical sensation of penetration or an orgasm. More often, it might be I go to a place of trust. Like I trust my partner so deeply, and that's really important to me. Or I go to a place of connection. I never feel more connected to them. Power dynamics, maybe that is what one of your big reasons for sex. You really love that place. So find out what yours is and how else can you access that. So let's say it is trust. What is another way that your partner can show you how much they can be trusted, or you can feel that immense trust? And I'm not even talking about just around sex. Maybe, it's like something like bungee jumping, where you go, I've really got to trust you to go tandem with, whatever it might be. But how can you elicit the feeling that you get or the place you go to in sex? So if it's connection, can you lovingly and intimately touch? And this is where we could maybe expand our definition and explore. So yes, maybe we're not able to have penetrative, unprotected vaginal sex. Could we have anal sex? Are we interested in that? Is this a great time to slowly explore that? Can we have, and obviously check with your medical providers, but could you have protected sex? Could be a bit of novelty. Oh, fun. Oh, we're going to put a condom on. I haven't done that in years, if you see that, right? What about kink? A lot of kink, there's no penetration or sex on the table. Maybe you could explore shibari, or you could explore tantra, or you could use that energy to do a sexy photo shoot together, right? There's lots of ways you can access sex that don't have to be penetration. And if you're in a clinic or in a treatment facility or something like that, how can you bring some of those things from home? What's your sexy playlist you can pop on? Can you bring a cute little aromatherapy candle, not a candle, you can't really have that in the medical room, but one of those ones that smell without the flame. What can you into that appointment, maybe you could wear some sexy lingerie underneath. What can you do to bring that intimacy and that thing that you access, that trust or connection, into that room or that moment? There's so many ways to do it outside of penetration. We've got to maybe open our minds a little bit and have fun, play with it. It might not work for you, one might. The injection of play into your relationship is generally only going to bring healthy things. So even if you go, well, we tried this and you're in hysterics laughing on the floor going, that didn't really work, playful and it's fun, and that can be a great connection on its own.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I remember when I was freezing my eggs. I mean, it makes sense to me, like from an IVF and egg freezing standpoint, because if you did accidentally ovulate all the eggs that were being stemmed and you did have sex at, the opportune moment, you think, oh, well, I haven't been pregnant for the past 12 plus months and that's why I need IVF in the first place. Like, that's probably not going to happen. But the risk of then really high order multiples goes up, and nobody in the medical world likes high order multiples. So that's the main reason why. So yeah, there is risk in that situation. But yeah, like you said, that element of risk can be a turn on for a lot of people. So
yeah, absolutely. So what can you do to either eroticize that, or if it's the opposite and you're finding all this clinicalness is really drooping your eroticism, look for it in other moments and other ways.
Yeah.
And try and encourage it where you can.
Yeah. We might leave with this final question, Amanda. When should people trying to conceive seek help with sex, their relationship, intimacy, and why is it important to prioritize this in the sea of other priorities that people have when trying to conceive and navigating infertility?
I think one of the reasons that we would prioritize this is because we already have so many emotions and vulnerabilities around sex. And like we talked about today, when we add pressure and difficulty on top of that, that can grow quite exponentially. And sex is a determinant on the satisfaction and health in your relationship. So I'm not trying to say if you can't or don't have sex, you don't have a healthy relationship at all. We have lots of people who are asexual who don't engage in sex or for painful reasons don't. But that in itself then needs to be conversations and needs, like we've sort of talked about, needs to be then built upon other ways of finding intimacy. So we maybe might feel a little selfish, silly, indulgent by prioritizing something like sex. And I'm here to tell you no. Like, it is a beautiful thing. You deserve pleasure. You deserve a rich, enjoyable sex life on your own with your partner. So there's no reason why you shouldn't prioritize this if you're able to. When should you seek help? When you're both willing to, I think, is really important. So again, the more pressure we add on ourselves, and look, for some people, therapy or seeking help actually may make it worse, because it may, just because of their culture, the way that they see the world, they may increase their chance of feeling like a failure or feeling certain emotions. So when it becomes a point where it's distressing you or your partner, or as you said, it's really becoming a noticeable level of contention in your relationship that you're both not able to navigate on your own, that's when I would say maybe look to seek out help, and look for help that suits you both. So yes, you could absolutely come and see a qualified counsellor, a sexologist, a psychologist. You could go to therapy. That might not work for you. Maybe what you could do is come and listen to like the backlog of Steph's podcast. You could go onto Instagram and read some educational pieces there. So again, engage in that as a team. That could be the way you seek help. So making sure that it's appropriate help for you both and what you both want and need and like, and that you're making that choice as a team together.
That is so helpful. What a beautiful way to wrap up the podcast. Thank you so much, Amanda, for coming on and sharing your insights and expertise in this area. I know this is going to be such a popular episode, and I did want to talk about pregnancy and postpartum, so I might have to get you back for another episode to talk about those, because I know that will be another hot topic of conversation, of sex in pregnancy and postpartum. So mark your diary for another chat.
honest, any topic around sex I could talk about for hours. So more than happy to come back. And yeah, I want to just finish on, if you've listened to this, you're not alone. This is, and if you can, reach out to a girlfriend to share. And what you might find, so I actually did this in the last week in preparation. So yes, I deal with this with lots of my clients, but I reached out to a few girlfriends and said, tell me your experiences around this if you're happy to share. And some of the things that they shared with me, I didn't know before, because while they were going through it, it was so hard. And one of the things that I heard over and over again was, I wish I had have reached out. So if you can find that one friend that you trust that's non-judgmental to say, hey, I'm having a hard time with this, what you might find is it opens up then a world of support and you're not on your own, and that pressure alone can really be so helpful for that really difficult time you're in.
Yeah, diffuse some of that pressure, share the load. I think the act of sharing is so powerful, and in so many different contexts, in fertility, in endo, in sex, and so many elements, it just really does make the world of difference to let your nearest and dearest in, and then of course professionals when that's right for you. Amanda, I'll leave all the links so people can find you on Instagram and all that good stuff in the show notes. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you. Catch you in the next episode.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I know it was a bit of a different one, but an important topic to discuss. Nothing is taboo around here, so we love talking about all things related to fertility and preconception health, not just nutrition, despite the title. So I am definitely going to get Amanda back on to talk about sex during pregnancy and postpartum and after birth and all of that good stuff. And let me know in my DMs at @the_dietologist if that would be something you would be keen to hear as well. Don't forget to follow on your favorite podcast streaming platform, whatever you're listening to now. Flick on over, hit follow, leave us a 5-star rating in Apple Podcasts and Spotify. That really helps us get more ear holes into our podcast world. And of course, do share it with a family member or friend or your partner who may find this episode useful. And until the next one, everyone, bye. Fertility Friendly Food, the podcast, acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognises the continuing connections to lands, waters and community. We pay our respects to First Nation cultures and to the elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations people tuning in today. This podcast is recorded on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.